Hello everyone, my name is Blake and I'm going to be refuting Kristen Carter's speech. Her claim was that students who attend same-sex schools benefit from that system. Now I personally don't believe in this, just for many reasons, but two reasons that came up were that her evidence wasn't very relevant from her speech, and that her statistics really couldn't be used and pertain to the topic really. And I found a quote from a site called, from the American Civil Liberties Union website, and it was an article on same-sex schools, and it said, "Real life is not segregated by gender. Students need to work, play, and learn in a diverse environment that reflects the society that they will one day enter." And I completely agree with this. Why would you train in one type of situation, and you're going to have to end up switching right after you finish learning that into a completely different one that has no correlation to the one that you were just working in. No matter how good you are, no matter how well you were trained, you will never be as proficient in an area that you weren't trained in. And so on to my first point about how her evidence wasn't very relevant. First, she brings up how boys and girls have different learning styles, and that's probably true. She mentions that they learn better in certain temperatures, like boys learn better in 69 degrees, whereas girls learn better at 75 degrees. But if you really want to go to that point, you're going to have to go to every kid is different. Every kid learns differently than any other kid, despite whether or not they're male or female. A male could learn the same way that a female does. You can never really tell. I don't think that gender really gender really has a specific specific type of learning just associated with it. And another point that she brought up was that it breaks stereotypes. And I don't believe that they break stereotypes at all just on my own, but I went to the same website and a different article from the American Civil Liberties Union, and it reads, "The American Civil Liberties Union released a preliminary report today that finds that single-sex education programs in public schools across the country overwhelmingly and unlawfully base their programs on discredited science rooted in sex stereotypes." So when she said that it prevents stereotypes, it actually, right there, it shows that they're using stereotypes to teach their kids. And although it may be getting rid of some of the stereotypes, it's not getting rid of all of them. But the main point about these two things is that they're irrelevant to the topic. They don't really relate to how it benefits the kid or student that attends the school. How does not having stereotypes in one way, but having stereotypes in another way, affect how well they're learning? My second point is that her statistics weren't very useful. One that she used was the Florida comprehensive test, which is like the STAR testing for California. And I don't feel that you could use one state as a blanket or a generality for all education. I feel like it should have been like at least the national average that people got on the test and whatnot like that, and stuff like that. Another source used was the NASSPE, which was the National Association for Single-Sex Public Education. That's a clearly biased organization right there. They're for single-sex education. And so you can't really use that information. She's choosing to use information that proves her point instead of showing both sides evenly. And also, I went to one of her sources, and I found out that what she failed to mention was the cons part of a pros and cons article, and that at the end it concludes that there's no right or wrong answer, but rather it depends on how you feel personally whether or not you send your kid to a same-sex school. So she was happy to tell you about all the pros of sending your kid to a same-sex school, but forgot to tell you about how it wasn't good and how it can affect your child. And I have a couple of friends that go to same-sex schools, and they just didn't like it. They said that they missed out on social situations that they wouldn't have been able to learn unless if they went to a co-ed school. So in conclusion, I found that her evidence wasn't very relevant, and therefore I was not able to come to the same conclusion that she was. And the evidence and the statistics to support the evidence, they weren't fit for the situation. So thank you for listening.
All right, you state the general claim of the advocate, but, excuse me, but not really their supporting structure. You're going to present your own supporting structure in responding to those 2 points. You start off with a generic piece of information from the ACLU that challenges the concept of this based on it not reflecting real life, which is not directly responsive to the question of whether or not people learn differently in these situations, but rather whether or not there's a long-term benefit or if there's a negative consequence to this. At the end of the argument, you come back to this idea of there being a negative consequence, and again, it's presented as something that we should balance against whatever advantages there are, but those are not quantified either. The best we have are a couple of examples that you provide at the end of friends who weren't very happy at the same-sex school that they went to. I assume that's because they couldn't get a date at the same-sex school that they went to. That doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't learn anything. And since that's what the advocate's talking about, we need some information that applies to learning, not just to the social issues that are going on there. You do kind of reduce one argument on learning styles and the whole example that she had of evidence talking about the different temperatures to being, look, it's going to be different for every kid, and I think that that's an understandable point. However, if we can have an aggregate result that benefits because we've grouped those kids together in one classification or another by sex, then you need to have an explanation as to why that would be an inadequate response. Since it would be great to respond to all kids individually, that's fine, but we can't always do that. Why is responding in the way that we can classify them problematic or inadequate? And I don't think you've got a very strong answer on that. You did have a quote from the ACLU that says that these groups are relying on discredited studies, and I thought that was a good piece of information, although it's kind of generic as to what studies they're talking about. It's not particularly the studies that the advocate is citing. I do think that there's a good challenge, there's a relevance challenge talking about whether or not stereotyping matters on this particular point, and I think that that's a reasonable press to be making there. On the second point, where you're talking about the statistics not being usable, I think this is where you're stretching it a little bit. If we've got data from an entire state, and it's not an insignificant state, it's a pretty substantial state, what's wrong with making an inductive generalization from that data? You would have to show that the states are substantially different, or the student populations or education is substantially different, or that the culture is substantially different, that it is not really generalizable. And I think you're kind of presuming that it's the advocate's point when they've given some evidence for their point and you have no evidence on your point. You should at least explain why the generalization shouldn't be made, and I don't think you do that as clearly. I think you've misunderstood the nature of bias. The fact that you have an advocacy group doesn't necessarily mean that they're biased. The reason that group probably exists is because they found the data and now they want to take that data and activate it. I think the better argument would be to argue that independent data is more reliable, that their enthusiasm, for instance, might blind them to faults in the process, and then talk about those faults a little bit more. Like I said at the end, I think you need to have some data on those points too, and it just doesn't seem like, you've got some okay presses on the data that the advocate presented, but I think you need some more research on your own. All right, thank you.